All right, so in addition to just giving you the PowerPoints for the various units, I thought it would be a good idea if I recorded them as well so you could kind of hear and learn along if you so choose. This might be more helpful for you, it might not be. It's just kind of an extra resource if you need it. So this one is going to cover kind of unit 1.1 and 2. It's the chemistry of life, so it kind of focuses on water as the main source of life, as well as carbon. And just thinking about this in the bigger context, Unit 1 is going to count for about 8 to 11% of the AP test at the end of the year. So as I mentioned, we're going to talk about water in this one, hydrogen bonding, and the other elements of life. And then subsequent PowerPoints will kind of cover the other elements related to Unit 1. But really the bulk after this is going to just be about biomolecules, which we'll get into later. Okay, so before we actually talk about biochemistry stuff, we need to figure out what you may remember from actual chemistry. There's two things, elements and compounds. Element, if you look at the periodic table, you know there's over 100 of them. It's a pure substance. It is the simplest possible form of something. It can't be broken down. So hydrogen, nitrogen, you can see in the corner, Si is silicon. All of those are examples of elements. At the top of the screen, you see sodium and chloride. Those are chlorine. Those are examples of elements. Now, when you start to put those together in different ways, then that makes a compound. So when you put at least two of them together in some kind of ratio, like sodium Na and chlorine Cl makes salt, sodium chloride, or NaCl. Down here we have H2O, which is water, and CO2, carbon dioxide. So these are all compounds. They contain more than one element and therefore can be broken down. Okay, so there are 25 basic elements that consist and keep us alive. The majority are CHNO, which stand for carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen. And then there, to the lesser degree, we have phosphorus, sulfur, calcium, K is potassium, and other trace elements like iron and iodine, which is why we have iodized salts. We need to have a little bit of iron in our diet, otherwise we become anemic. So at the bottom, I kind of put, remember this. That's how I always remember it. Schnapps. It sounds silly, but it's carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. So those are the main elements of life. Here's another kind of breakdown table that shows you what that breaks down to be. So mostly we are oxygen in terms of how much our body weight is, and that's a lot to do with water and how big oxygen is in terms of weight. And then you can see the other elements to a lesser degree. Okay, so thinking about that, and if you zoomed in on an element, you would see an atom, which is the smallest possible unit of matter that can be in order to actually maintain properties of an element. So this consists of a nucleus, which is the center part. You can see here. And then surrounding that nucleus, you have what's called orbitals, or a cloud of other subatomic particles. And they're called subatomic because they are consisting of and come together to make an atom. So inside the nucleus, you have the positively charged protons. So if you're pro something, you're for it, so it's positive. And then neutrons, which are neutral. That makes up the interior nucleus. And then surrounding are the electrons, which are negatively charged. And they kind of balance out however many protons you happen to have in the center. So protons and neutrons have mass, meaning that they're a little bit larger. Electrons are super small, so they don't really have mass because they're so small. Here's an example of looking at the periodic table. This is helium. So it's got the abbreviation He. So you'll see that there. In terms of the way that this one is organized, you have a mass number and an atomic number. The atomic number is just the number of protons. So however many protons are in the nucleus. You could also look at it by the number of electrons, because positives and negatives should always balance out in a pure element. That will give you the atomic number, and that's the number that is listed on the chart. So helium is number 2. Mass is how much it weighs. So this includes both the weighted proton parts and the neutron parts. So in this case, it's 4, which would mean that helium has 2 protons and 2 neutrons. They're not always going to be the exact same number. It just worked out in this instance. Okay, so here we go. You can see in this particular one, you can see where the electrons are. Those are the negatively charged guys floating around the nucleus. And you can see how they're distributed. This is something called valence electrons. So it has to do with how they're configured around the nucleus shell. The valence ones are kind of the outermost ones. So there is a pattern that helped it get organized onto the periodic table. If it has 1 in the outermost shell, it's in the first column. If it has 2 in the outermost shell, it's got 2, and so on all the way to 8. And depending on how these are organized, they have different properties and might want to come together in different ways. But we don't really need to get into the super specifics of that. But in context of biochemistry, they do help to form bonds with one another. So there are different types of bonds. The strongest bonds, first we have covalent, which means they are sharing electrons. Co means together. So think of covalent as sharing them together. This can be polar or nonpolar. Polar means that they're sharing, but they're not quite sharing equally. One of the atoms is pulling more than the other. So because of difference in electronegativity, meaning one has a stronger pull on electrons than the other one. There's a weaker one and a stronger one. So water is an excellent example of this. Oxygen has a stronger pull on electrons than hydrogen. So it's going to form an interesting shape and be polar, which is what gives it a lot of its properties. Nonpolar means that they're totally equally shared. So this happens all the time when you have diatomic compounds, for example, elements. So for example, oxygen, both oxygens have an equal pull on electrons. So that would be considered nonpolar. Here's a picture of what you would see for water. You can see that the arrows are going towards the oxygen because it has a stronger pull. And because electrons are negative, that means that this area up on the top by the oxygen has a more negative charge. And then when the electrons are pulled away, that results in slightly positive charges by the hydrogen. Whereas in something like oxygen or O2, they're equally shared, so you don't have any kind of pluses or minuses around it. But regardless, they're sharing. Another type of strong bond is going to be ionic. And this is when there are givers and takers. So something is going to be positively charged, meaning it gave up its electrons, and something's going to be negatively charged, meaning it took electrons. They're always trying to get to a happy number of kind of 8 in its outermost shell. So some of them need to lose electrons to do that, and some of them need to gain. So when there's an exchange, it's an ionic bond. Salt is an excellent example of that. A weaker type of bond is called a hydrogen bond. And this happens when you have polar molecules that have slightly positive and negative charges. They kind of stick together. The positive part of one of them, like in this central water molecule here, the positive part will then be slightly attracted to the negative part of another water molecule. And so that's what we call a hydrogen bond, when you have two kind of polar molecules sticking together. And it's not super strong, but it is what allows and gives some of the properties of water, like cohesion. But it doesn't have to always be with the same compound either. For example, on the right, you can see water is sticking with ammonia. Here's just kind of a breakdown of what that looks like. So covalent is a super strong bond. Ionic is slightly weaker, but it helps to form quick reactions. And hydrogen is what gives a lot of water its properties, but it's super weak. And either way, all of these can be made or broken in different types of chemical reactions. All right. Long review, but here we go. So in terms of the AP biology test, what you're going to need to know, you're going to need to know the subcomponents of biological molecules and their sequence. You're going to need to know that living systems depend on water. So you're going to need to be able to talk to the points of what is polarity, what is hydrogen bonding. You're also going to need to be able to know the properties of water as a result of that hydrogen bonding, like cohesion, as I mentioned earlier, adhesion, and surface tension, which I will go through. All right. So in the little intro, I mentioned water is a polar molecule. So they're sharing, but they're not sharing equally. So there's a little positive side by the hydrogens and a negative side by the oxygens. And because of this and the way that it's structured, water is able to form up to 4 bonds. So it kind of surrounds itself with other water molecules. So here's 1, 2, and then the oxygen area is so big that 2 of these guys can actually fit in that area. So it could be surrounded by 4. Cohesion, again, co means together, so covalent meant sharing electrons. Cohesion means that the water molecules are going to stick together. And as a result of that, we get surface tension. Surface tension is the measure of how hard it is to break or stretch a liquid. So, for example, if you've ever filled up a glass too much to the very, very, very rim, and it kind of looks like it's got a small bubble over it, but it hasn't spilled. That's an example of cohesion. The water molecules are actually sticking together and holding firm instead of just running off of the side of the cup. And the strength of that cohesion is what we call surface tension. So if it has a high surface tension, then it would be hard to kind of pop that bubble. If it had a low surface tension, then it would be very, very easy to break that bubble. You can also see it too when you put water on like a penny, see how many drops you can put, that kind of thing. And then as a result of surface tension, different animals and insects are able to take advantage. So these water striders, and for example, the spider, appear to be able to walk on water because they can kind of distribute their weight enough so that they are below that surface tension threshold. So they can kind of walk on it without actually breaking through the cohesive forces. Adhesion, think of like an adhesive. It sticks to something. It's bonding between unalike molecules. So this is not the water molecules themselves sticking together, but it is sticking to something else. In this case, in the picture here, we have water molecules that are sticking to the leaf. Yes, there's water molecules sticking together, but they're also sticking to the leaf. And this happens all the time when water is moving its way up a plant, which is why if you water it in the bottom, and then actually the water somehow makes its way up, like we'll learn by capillary action, but it's adhesion. The water is able to stick to the various tubes in the plant and work its way up to the very tippy top. It's kind of a necessary skill for the water to kind of go against gravity, so you're not just watering the roots all the time. Another example of this is called transpiration. As I mentioned, it moves water up to the top of the plants. So it couples both the idea of cohesion and adhesion together to ensure that water makes its way to every part of the plant. Other properties of water that are kind of important for life, high specific heat. What that basically means that it doesn't change temperature very easily. And super large bodies of water are able to store a lot of that heat. So for example, in coastal areas, it's a lot warmer because the water can absorb and kind of insulate. It takes on a lot of the heat from the environment and therefore helps to keep the area warm and create a stable climate. Humans, as us, are 65% water. So it's very important that we also maintain a stable temperature. So when we are exposed to various environments, our body tries to regulate that. And one of the advantages is that water does not change temperature easily. Another important property is evaporative cooling. So if you think about your sweat, when the sweat evaporates off of our skin, it actually makes us feel cooler. Same thing for plants. Expansion upon freezing. This is important for all sea life, because basically when water crystallizes and turns into ice, it makes kind of a lattice structure. And that lattice structure is less dense than water itself, which means that then the ice is going to float. So what happens is then a sheet of ice might form in winter at the top of a lake, and it then is able to insulate or prevent further temperature changes to the water below. So that way the whole lake doesn't freeze and the life in the water can survive. Switching gears back to chemistry a little bit more. Water is called the universal solvent for a reason. So to understand this, a solution is just a mixture of two substances, and a solvent is the thing that's doing the dissolving. It's the liquid of the kind of solution that you're creating. So I always think of like making, powdered lemonade. The powder would be the solute, the thing that is dissolving, and the water would be the solvent, the dissolver. So a lot of things dissolve in water, which is why it's called the universal solvent. Other terms that we're going to come in and talk about later when we talk about plasma membranes and things like that are hydrophilic and hydrophobic. Philic means loving. So hydrophilic are things that love water. So polar things like water, which is why they dissolve easily, like salt, sugar, blood is also hydrophilic. Phobic means fearing, so that means they don't like water. So these are going to be non-polar things that don't have a charge associated with them. Oil and other fats and lipids. So if you think about oil and water never mixing, it's because oil is hydrophobic. And then the interior of a cell membrane, which we'll learn about later. Okay, so thinking about elements of life, takeaways that you're going to need to know. Organisms exchange matter with their environment. So we do this to grow, like we eat food, to reproduce, and maintain organization. And in order to do this, we need atoms and molecules from the environment. So some of the key molecules that are very important to keep us alive are things like carbon and nitrogen. And after this point, I have a bunch of old slides that are not totally up to date, but they might be helpful for you. So if you feel like you want to cruise through those for extra information, by all means. They are still important information. They just don't totally align with how we are going to order things in 2019 related to the new curriculum framework.